Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. By the seventh day, God completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for he had rested from his work of creation. We have come to the final day of the creation account, day 7. And what we want to talk about today from these verses of Scripture is, what is this seventh day? What is this day on which God rested? What does it mean for us that at the culmination of creation, there is ceasing from striving? So we have this passage that we're going to look at this morning, Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, this final day, this day of rest. And what we're going to do as we look at it together is kind of look at two things. First, what is it? What's happening here? What's going on? And then we're going to talk about, what does it mean for us that God rested on the seventh day? So, if you have a Bible, I'd encourage you to get that out as we look together at God's Word. So first we're going to start with this question. What is this seventh day rest? What's really going on with God resting on the seventh day? Now, if you notice in Genesis chapter 2, that passage of Scripture that I just read, it starts with, so the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. Now notice how this brings us back to the very beginning of the book of Genesis that we've been looking at the last number of weeks, to verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So we get to this verse in chapter 2, and we have this repetition of that, the heavens and the earth. And so this is showing that this is kind of a summary. This is wrapping up this section, concluding the section. It's kind of like a bookend. You have the beginning, the heavens and the earth, and then you have the end here. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. So we have this wrapped up. We know that it has this sort of section together. But there's still one more day. There's still the seventh day. And what's going on here? Well, as we read through it, it's interesting. There's kind of a striking aspect that there's a threefold reference here to work. So it seems kind of repetitious when you read it or when you listen to it. But notice that work is mentioned 3 times. So verse 2, it's mentioned there twice, and then in verse 3. So by the seventh day, God completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he had rested from his work of creation. So we have this contrast between the work of God and then rest. And what is this work? Well, the last part of verse 3 makes it clear. It's the work of creation. It's the work that's been talking about, how God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in them. So this is the work. The work of God has been completed. It's also quite striking in this, as you think about the pattern that we've looked at through the 7 days of creation, that here on the seventh day, there's no repetition of that phrase that's been at every other day. There was evening and morning. Remember that? There was evening and morning the first day. There was evening and morning the second day. There was evening and morning the third day, and on and on and on. But here, on the seventh day, there is no reference. Notice that omission, and it's there deliberately because it marks out the seventh day as significant. It stands out, it's set apart, which we're going to get to in a moment. So this seventh day is unique, it's different. We can see there's nothing that is created on it. There's no work that is done. It's set apart. And it says something interesting, that God blessed the seventh day. Now, we've seen God blessing things. He blessed human beings that they would be fruitful and multiply. He blessed the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky. But now it's interesting, he blesses a day, which is kind of an odd thing to do, to bless something that's inanimate. And in contrast to human beings, who he says to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, to do it, that's our task. The blessing here is a blessing that is not really fully described, but we know that it relates to rest. And so there's a contrast between the work of creation, to fill up creation, as we talked about last week, to be fruitful, to multiply, to complete this work, and now this blessing of rest. So the question then is our mind is, what is this blessing, and how does it contrast with work? What is the blessing of it? Well, on the seventh day, God rested from his work of creation. It's interesting. We have to kind of look at this word here of rest to get the idea. The Hebrew word is Shabbat, which is where the word Sabbath comes from. And here it's the verb, it's the action. God rested. And what does it mean? It means, really, the core idea of it is that it means he ceased. He stopped. He ceased from labor. So we have to spend a little bit of time getting in our heads what this means. Because you look at it and you say, rest, okay, I know what rest means, but what is it? Well, rest or ceasing is not the same as relaxing or sleeping. I think that's sometimes what we think of when we think of resting. It's like, okay, you lie down on the couch, close your eyes, put your feet up. That's what we think of resting as. But that's not what it's talking about here. It's talking about ceasing from activity. So it's a greater concept than that. It's not that, okay, God was tired out. He goes, well, that was a long day. I better get some sleep. No. It's the idea of completion. The task is finished. And when the task is finished, you can stop. You can cease from the work that you're doing. And there's also an idea of taking up residence, of dwelling, of being in this creation and in this work that he has completed. It's sort of like if you think about the idea of like building a house. So when you build a house, you have to complete all the steps. There's so much that goes into it. Foundation, the walls, the siding, the roofing. You got to get it watertight, put the windows on, but then you're not finished. You have to paint, you have to put flooring in, and even then when the building is complete, it's not finished yet. You have to put the furnishings in and put the decorations up and all that kind of stuff. And once you get it all finished, the work is complete, then what do? You rest in it. You dwell in it. You fill it up. The point of making the house and putting all the stuff in it is that it's a place that you live. And that's the idea that's going on here. Now, to understand this a little bit more, we need to look at one of the closest biblical parallels to this passage here in Genesis 2. And that is the section on the building of the tabernacle. So, you know the story, Exodus, the people of God brings them out, the Israelites, out of Egypt. They're wandering around in Sinai. And after God gives them the Ten Commandments, and they've gone through all of that, are you going to follow the Lord, and all the ups and downs of that, then he comes to them and he says, I want you to build this tabernacle, this tent, and it's going to be my dwelling place. So from Exodus 25 all the way to the end of the book, Exodus chapter 25 through chapter 40 is basically the description. This is the part where if you're doing the Bible reading plan at the beginning of the year, you go, Genesis, okay, I got that. Exodus, I got that. And you get to this part, and this is where you get bogged down. Right? This is where you go, oh, I don't know if I can keep reading on. Because it gets to all these details about how they built the tabernacle. What I want us to do is look at this because there's a striking parallel here to Genesis chapter 2 that I think will help us understand what actually is taking place with God resting. So if you turn to Exodus 25, this is the beginning of this section about building this tabernacle, this place where God is going to dwell. And verse 1 says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, tell the Israelites to take up an offering for me." And then if you jump down to verse 8, "They are to make a sanctuary for me, so that I may dwell among them. You must make it according to all that I show you, the pattern of the tabernacle as well as the pattern of its furnishings." So this is the beginning. And between Exodus 25, verse 1, and through the end, chapter 40, God gives instructions of what they're supposed to complete. All this detail about everything they have to make and everything they have to put into it. God gives this instruction. What's interesting about it is that when you look at the structure, God gives his instruction about building the tabernacle, all its complexity. He gives it in a structured way. And he actually gives it through these speeches. And anybody want to guess how many there are? Let's throw out a biblical example. There are 7. There are 7 speeches in this section where God says to Moses, there are 7 times, "And God said to Moses, let there be." You can go through this structure. And what's interesting in this, when you get to the last one, chapter 40, we're going to look at. Notice the first part of chapter 40, verse 1. "And the Lord said to Moses." This is the 7th of these, "and God said." And he says, "You are to set up the tabernacle and the tent of meeting." So they have everything done, and he tells them to put it all together, set it up, consecrate themselves. So they do all of that work. Then jump down in chapter 42, verse 33. So they do all this stuff. Moses set up the surrounding courtyard of the tabernacle and the altar and hung a screen for the gate of the courtyard. And then this phrase, "So Moses finished all the work." He completed the work. This is kind of significant. You just kind of jump over it. Okay, it's summarizing. He completed all the work. But this phrase, "to finish or complete the work," that exact same phrase is the phrase in Genesis 2, verse 2. God completed his work. Now you say, well, how specific is that? Well, that particular phrase is actually only used between here, Genesis 2, the next place that it shows up in the whole Bible, and you know there's a lot of words, is Exodus 40, verse 33. And there's only one other time that this phrase is used, to complete all the work. You know what that is? It's when the temple is finished, which is what replaces the tabernacle. So it's used in 1 Kings chapter 7, and then also in Chronicles when they're talking about it. The only 3 places where this phrase, "to complete the work," is used in all of the Old Testament is in Genesis 2, and in Exodus 40, 33, and then in the accounts in Kings and Chronicles, we're talking about completing the temple. Now this is a big hint. It's hard for us to see it because, we're just reading it in English, but for the Hebrew people, this is really significant. And what it's showing is that when God created the tabernacle, and he did it in 7 speeches, "Let there be," and then he has them make it, God is showing that there's a connection between his creation of the world and the universe in 7 days and his building of the tabernacle. One interesting point is that the creation of the world, all the universe and everything in it, happens basically in 1 chapter plus a few verses. But when God has them make the tabernacle, it's from chapter 25 to 40. And they have to do all the work. It's gotten more difficult, but that's kind of a side issue. What we see here is, so God has created, so the temple and the tabernacle are a pattern. That's why when you read those sections and you see those things, think about the connection to Genesis. Why is it that God has lamps and lights that he puts in the temple? Why is it that they put trees all over the place? There's palm trees and fruit trees everywhere inside the temple. Because it's like the garden that we're going to read about here in chapter 2 of Genesis as we move along. So there's a parallel between the two. What am I getting at? Well, notice what's the very next thing that happens in Exodus 40 after Moses finished the work. So verse 33. So Moses finished all the work. He completed the work. Verse 34. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Notice it's exactly the same thing that happens when Solomon finishes the temple and completes all the work. And then they dedicate it, and the glory of the Lord fills it. So you have this pattern. So what is happening in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 2? When God completes all the work that he's done, and he rests. It's the idea, the picture, that all of creation is God's temple, his dwelling place. It's finished, and now he can be there, and he can dwell in it. He's taking up residence in this creation. This creation is the place where he is going to meet with, commune with the creations that he's made. That's the primary thrust of what it means that God finished his work and now he's taking up residence in his creation on this seventh day. The whole creation is his temple. Now this to us seems just kind of ho-hum. Oh yeah, God is everywhere, we know that. But think about the ancient people who had to travel so far and go through all the purification rituals to be able to even get close to the temple. You know, here we are, fall, Christmas season is coming up, and you think about that. Mary and Joseph, after Jesus is born, and they bring him from Bethlehem, and they take him to the temple to have him dedicated. You know, all that work, all that labor, all that things that they had to do. And you had to be cleansed, and you had to be prepared. Oh, by the way, you know, you have some blemish on your skin. You can't come in. You got to wait until you're purified. You got to quarantine yourself. You know, I think we all kind of understand that concept now, don't we? Because to enter the presence of God, you have to go to a special place. You have to be in a purified state. And yet, what Genesis 2:2 is saying is all of creation was God's dwelling. All of creation was his temple, this place where we could meet with him. It's quite incredible, that declaration. So now we can see why it is the case that God declared the seventh day holy. And holy just means set apart. It means distinct. It's not the same as the others. It's the distinct one. It's set apart. And in this case, it's set apart from the other days. It's a unique day. It's a special day. It's set apart to God. It's set apart to rest. That is, to cease from work and to dwell. To take up residence. What's interesting is this is the very first thing in all of creation that is declared holy, set apart. It's a concept that you see it in the Bible quite frequently, but here is the first thing. This is the first thing in creation that's set apart, is this day. It's the seventh day, and it's a holy day, which if you think about it, it's like a holiday. In fact, that's where our word holiday actually comes from, is the words holy and day. It's a holy day, a holiday. And a holiday is a day that's unique. It's set apart. It's not just like all the other days. That's why we like holidays. It's set apart. You don't have to work. Maybe there's special traditions. It's like Christmas. You know, Christmas, it's a holiday. It's a unique day. We do different things than we normally would do on a holiday. And in this case, it's the seventh day. It's like having Christmas every week. You know, some people would love that. Some people are like the Christmas every day kind of people. They would love this, right? Oh, Christmas every week. Isn't that great? It's a day that's set apart. It's holy. It's distinct. What's also significant here in this section is that as God, he creates the world, he rests, he dwells in it, he blesses the seventh day, he calls it holy. What's significant is that it's not followed by God establishing a Sabbath practice. So if you think about, for example, like Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, that we'll get to in a few weeks. After Adam and Eve are created and brought together and God establishes marriage, and then there's this pause where it says, Adam says, "This at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman, for she was taken out of man." And then there's this comment, verse 24, "This is why a man leaves his father and mother and bonds to his wife, and the two become one flesh." That's establishing the principle. Like at weddings, where we say, what God has joined together, let no one separate, comes from that principle. But here, it doesn't follow with that. It doesn't say God rested from his work. Therefore, you should. So the Sabbath principle, comes later. The declaration, you think of the Ten Commandments. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, is based on this foundation. But interesting, it's not declared here, which I think is significant. Part of the reason for that is because the focus here is not on human beings. It's on God. God is the one who rests. God is the one who dwells. God is the one who takes up residence in his creation, which gives us the reality of what is the focus of the universe? What is the purpose of it? What is the center of it? Not us. It's God. Even though, as I've said, the creation account is very human-focused, surprisingly so. But here, the focus is on God. It's God-focused. And the ultimate purpose of creation is God himself and this dwelling, this communication, this union between God and his creation. So what's happening here in Genesis 2 is not the Sabbath, as you might say from the Ten Commandments, but it is the principle of Sabbath. It's the foundation from which that comes. God ceased from his creative labor and he takes up residence in creation. It's also significant as we look at kind of the last piece of what is this here, the context in which this comes. Now, we tend to be, you look at the chapter, you go, oh, it's just chapter 2, this must be new, forget about what happened. But we shouldn't do that because it's a continuation. What happened just before this in chapter 1? Well, we looked at it last week, but chapter 1 of Genesis, verse 29. And God said, "Look, behold, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This food will be for you." The very thing that happens right before this is God provides food for his creatures. And we talked about last week that it's so opposite of every other concept in the ancient world about what creation was for. Human beings in every other culture were created to provide food and wine for the gods. But here, God doesn't ask anything from them. He just says, "I provide food for you." Now, why is this significant? Because there is always a connection between Sabbath and food. We'll just look at it for a second. I want to look at a couple of areas where there was misunderstanding of Sabbath, because I think it will help clear up some things. So one of these, you can just jot this down, is Exodus 16. We don't have time to go into all the details of it, but I'm going to kind of summarize it for you. So Exodus 16, they just passed through the Red Sea. They're out there wandering around, and they're running out of food. So this is the manna story. So they complain to God, and God says, okay, I'm going to send manna, which they don't even know what it is. It's this miraculous food. They don't know what it is. It just shows up. In the morning, when the dew evaporates, there it is on the ground. So you just got to go and pick it up. And you can gather a lot, and you can gather a little. But you always have just enough for however many people you have. Isn't that nice? That'd be nice. And it's like you go to the grocery store, you got the big family. I came from a big family. 2 grocery carts totally full. Because that's what you got to take for a big family. But here, you just gather and you have enough. And it shows up every morning. And you can't keep it because it spoils. So they have free food. Yay. The food from heaven, provided for by God. But then God gives them a specific command. He says, you can gather it 6 days, but the 7th day you cease from your work. So you can't gather. So on the 6th day, you gather twice as much. And it will keep good from that day to the next. Because all the other days, if you tried to keep it, it would spoil. So it's different. Day 7 is set apart. So they gathered every day. What happens, though, on the 7th day? They have a misunderstanding about it, and some of the people go out and gather. That should, let's just pause and think about that for a second. Because you got free food from heaven, right? And we're so used to grocery stores, you just pick it up, oh, the mix, you add water and you have food, okay? When they were making grain, though, they had to get the grain, and you have to grind it up, and you have to make it into flour, and then you put this is like flour. This is like before the grocery store, before the mills, you got flour just coming down. How easy it is, how nice it is, God provided it. But what do? Is they won't rest in God's provision. They won't trust him. Oh, we got to go out on the 7th day and gather or we won't have enough. We'll starve. Does that relate to any of our intentions? I can't possibly rest. Because if I cease, I won't have enough. I won't be enough. I won't accomplish enough. I won't be smart at whatever it is. So they failed to trust God's provision on that 7th day. This is the same reason why we don't rest, why we don't cease from striving. Because we think, if I stop, if I set aside for a moment, I won't have enough. Because we've forgotten what? That God is the one who provides. So that's the first misunderstanding of the 7th day rest. There's also a misunderstanding. It's interesting. It's worth going back to here. The 7th day Sabbath rests on the 7-day creation. So this is the 7th day of creation, and the Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. And there's a connection between these that you can't separate. So if we look at the days of creation and we just say to ourselves, is popular today, that, these are just 7 long periods. They're not days, they're long. Maybe they're 1,000 years. We don't know how long they are. The problem with that is that that's the foundation for the 7th day rest. If there's not a 7-day creation, then there's no Sabbath day. If these are if they're 7,000-year periods, then maybe there would be a 1,000-year rest every 7,000th year, but not a rest every day of the week. And I think this is significant because I don't think it's a coincidence that the erosion of the idea culturally, the principle of resting one day in 7, I don't think it's coincidental that also has coincided with the erosion of the truth that God created in 7 days. Because this foundation is based upon that reality. So they go together. Now the last misunderstanding. Now this we go to the New Testament. Because, so God rested here. It's the foundation for the Sabbath. He gave it to them in the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. So they were very concerned about that, the Jewish people. I want to turn to Mark, the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament, chapter 2. And Jesus is beginning his ministry. And he makes this significant statement that I think is important for us to know. Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Then Jesus told them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So what he's saying there is, this is not a law. The Sabbath, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, the 10 Commandments, is not created. We're not serving it. It is serving us. And this is kind of a surprising thing, but interesting. Note the context of this declaration that Jesus makes. Look at verse 23 of Mark chapter 2. So on the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields And his disciples began to make their way, picking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "Have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the priest and ate the sacred bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and also gave some to his companions. Then he told them the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." See again the context that Mark includes. It's about them what? Eating, food, provision. This is always the question that comes up. Why? Because it's our fundamental need as human beings. They need to be provided for. And we think, what do we have to do? I have to work for it. And if I don't work for it, I'm going to not have enough. But the reality is, remembering the Sabbath reminds us that it's not our work that provides for us. It's God that provides for us. So the purpose of the Sabbath rest is to rest in God, rest in God's provision that he will provide, and to trust that provision. To trust that provision in creation, but also to trust that provision in Christ. All right, so that's what the Sabbath day rest is. What does it mean for us that God rested on the seventh day? There's three principles for the Sabbath that I think are helpful for us as we think about if God rested on the seventh day, what does that mean? So the first of these is that the Sabbath rest needs to be God-focused. The whole point of Genesis 2, 1 through 3, is the idea that it's God-focused. God is the one who rests. God is the one who dwells in his creation. God is the one who creation is made for. And so as we think about this, the principle of Sabbath, it should be God-focused. Second is it should be resting in his provision, his providing for us. Cease from striving for ourselves, from this need to say that I have to provide everything, and if I stop, I'm not going to get what I need. Both material and also the spiritual needs. Because we can be just as materialistic, the rat race, I got to get ahead. We can be just as much motivated by that in our own righteousness. Oh, I have to do all these things, and I have to be a good Christian, and I got to read through the whole Bible in a year, and I got to do all this so that I can be a good Christian and I can provide for myself. And that is the wrong attitude as a Christian. Because the gospel is that God provides you righteousness, not the other way around. And I think we've done poorly as the church in general, the church, Big C Church, when we have forgotten this. And we need to be reminded of this more often than once a week, but definitely at least once a week, that the grace of Christ comes freely to you. And at its foundation, when we gather as Christians, that should be our foundational understanding. Not, okay, what do I have to do for God? It should be, how can I rest in the fact that he has done for me? So, rest in God's provision. And then the last, dwell with him. If all creation was created to be God's temple where he meets with his people, we should dwell with him in his temple, with his people. And this is where we have to ask the question, what is the temple today? It's not this building. It's not any building. It is the new temple, which is the people of God, washed in the blood of Christ, indwelt by the Spirit of God. So when we meet with God, when we dwell with God, we dwell with his people. This is why the Bible says, don't forsake gathering together of yourselves. Because this is where God meets people. And of course, we have a great reminder of that. We spent the last 6 months not in the building, outside, gathered. And the reality is that is no less significant than being in here. The building is helpful because it keeps the rain off and we can be, warm because of the heater. But gathering outside is just as good as gathering inside because it's not the building. It's the people of God gathered in the name of Christ. And that should be a significant part because the whole purpose of God creating this and resting on the seventh day is dwelling with his people. So just to get a little more practical, God focused. We sometimes get off on this and we think Oh, it's a day of rest. So Sunday is my day to sleep in. If you have Sunday as my day anywhere in there, you're already off. Oh, this is bad. Sleeping in is not a bad thing. But it's not your day to sleep in. The point is, it's God-focused. Now, some of us, we don't get enough rest. I'm not against that, resting. But recognize this is not for us. It should be God-focused. It's a day to set other things aside so that we can focus our attention upon God. Second, rest in his provision. Trust in God that if you rest, you accomplish less, but you can trust God for that. If you say, I'm not going to, and fill in the blank, because I'm going to focus on God, you will accomplish less. You just will. If you say, I'm not going to do whatever work, I'm not going to check my work emails on Sunday, so I can focus on God. You'll accomplish less. You'll have stuff that's not done. Trust in God's provision in that you can leave some things undone, because the world does not depend upon you. It's God's provision. And then last, dwell with him. Recognize the presence of God. Gathering is such an important thing. But it's more than just being, you could be, okay, I go to church, being physically present. It's the idea of recognizing and living in the reality of the indwelling of God. That when we gather with God's people in his name for the purpose of worshiping him, it's not just a service. It's dwelling in the presence of God as his redeemed people. So gathering is a significant thing for that. So that's what it means that on the seventh day of creation, God rested from all his work that he had done. Let's pray.